Organizing Mule projects. Let's look at what the folder structure for a Mule project would typically look like. The names of folders indicate what they should contain. Source test folders should contain files only needed at development time, like schema and example files for metadata types, sample data for transformers. And the reason we put things in source test is when we package these apps, they're not going to be included in the deployable zip that will be sent to the server. In this next walkthrough, we'll see how to create a well-organized Mule project to set ourselves up for future creation. We'll create a project with a new RAML file that's added to Anypoint platform. We'll review the project's configuration and properties file, create an application properties file in a global configuration file, add Java files and test resource files to the project, and finally create and examine the contents of the deployable archive that we can generate from that project. Let's go to Anypoint Studio and get started. In Anypoint Studio, if we have an existing project running, let's stop it. And if you still have AP Dev examples open, let's also right-click and close that since we'll be making a new project in this example. We'll then go ahead and right-click, go to New, and choose Mule Project. The name of this Mule project is going to be apdev-flights-ws. And we'll also check Add API Kit Components. We're going to use the Browse button to go out to our platform, and we will choose Anypoint Platform in this dialog. Once in your Browse API Manager for APIs, let's create a new API from this dialog. We'll call this API MMUULLEE Flights API, and the version will be 1.0. The description will be returns flights for United, American, and/or Delta Airlines. So this will be our Mule United Airport app that we're getting started on. We'll hit OK. And then the application, or API rather, should be created. We'll select the MMUULLEE Flights API inside of here, and we'll hit OK. And then, once we've got ourselves set up, we'll then click Finish. Now, before we continue on with development, let's make sure that this API has also been created inside of the API Manager. We can do this by heading out to a web browser. In this web browser, going to anypoint.mulesoft.com. From anypoint.mulesoft.com, log in with the same credentials you've been using throughout class. And from the navigation in the top left, we'll head to the API Manager area. Inside of API Manager, you're likely to see MMUULLEE Flights API in 1.0. And if you click on 1.0, you can see some information about this specific flight. Now, you saw earlier in class, what we did is we went in and we defined the RAML definition. Now, typically, if we were starting this as a real project, we again would want to start with that interface. We'd want to define our API and interactions first. But since we're honing in on just some of the core development concepts with Mule, we're going to leave that API definition creation to the side for now and head back into Studio and start getting our project structure set up so that we can begin developing and learning more about development-oriented topics. So, let's return to Anypoint Studio. From Anypoint Studio, let's make sure we're in the design perspective in the top right of our screen. Once in design, you should be able to head to the API sync view and you should be able to see your RAML file. Let's open up the apdev flights web service project and we can see the api.raml inside. If we double click on api.raml, you'll notice that it's currently an empty file. Now, we have a flights.raml that we can use inside of our student files. So let's go ahead and open up our student files on our machine. Inside of our student files, underneath the resources directory, you'll find the flights.raml file. Let's go ahead and open the flights.raml file in a text editor. And then copy the flights.raml contents into our api.raml piece of the text editor here in Eclipse or Studio. We'll save this up as api.raml, and now we're looking good. We have our RAML file imported, and we are ready to start developing this API in Studio. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about getting the project set up cleanly. First, we'll go ahead and upload the changes for API RAML, making sure that the platform gets those same updates. Back in our project, if we double click on the APDev flights WS XML, we should see an empty XML file. Nothing was generated because we didn't really have any XML or anything to generate the API kit off of. So in this case, we're going to start with the implementation. Again, typically we'd start with a generation from the RAML file, but because we want to focus on some development concepts, we're going to jump right over to implementation. We'll right click on the APDev flight XML, and we will go ahead and refactor and rename. Let's rename this to implementation.xml. And with implementation XML created, now we're going to have a base place that we can start implementing different pieces. In the mule-app.properties, let's go ahead and set our environment. We're going to set the environment for this application to dev to start off with. We'll save that environment change and close out the mule-app.properties. Let's also locate and open mule-deploy.properties. And just to show you around this file is going to describe how the application should start up in the server. It'll specify the domain, which we'll learn about soon, which config resources or XML files compose the application, the encoding, and some other settings as well. We'll close out. Now let's create a properties file for our application that we can use later. We'll right-click inside of Source Main Resources and create a new file. Let's name this file flights-dev.properties and hit enter. With flights-dev.properties created, we'll start off by creating a property that I know we'll need a bit later, which is HTTP port, and set that to 8081 and hit save. So we've got some basic properties in place. We've also got an environment variable in place from our Mule app properties as well. Let's save and close this property file. And let's create another XML file in APDev flights WS. We'll go to New, Mule configuration file, and we'll call this global or global XML and hit finish. With global XML in place, we're going to be placing all of our global elements that are shared or referenced across different XML files here. So we'll go to our global elements tab and click create, and we'll start off by creating that property placeholder that we need to inject our properties with. So if we type in property placeholder and double click on property placeholder, the location box inside of here will say flights dash, and with a $sign and curly braces, we'll put in env so that it injects our environment variable dot properties. So that when it resolves to flights dev properties, such as our case in Studio, we will load this property file into our application. And let's hit OK. All right, next up, let's head over to our create button once again, and let's create a new HTTP listener config inside of here. We'll double click on the HTTP listener config. And instead of hard coding port, let's go ahead and use http.port as a property that we'll get from our property placeholder referencing our property file. We'll hit OK. Save up the global XML, and we'll close the file. Now, let's look inside of Source Main Resources, and let's go ahead and open up the log4j XML file. You'll find it easier to read by clicking the Source tab. And for those of you who are familiar with log4j, this is the log4j2 configuration file that the application will use when deployed to the Mule runtime to determine how the log level should be. Those of you who aren't familiar with log4j, think of this like a big settings file that determines how verbose or how concise the Mule app should be when it logs things about what's happening inside. We're not going to make any changes here now, just wanted to open it up and show you where it is and what it contains. We'll exit out of log4j XML. All right, now in our file browser, let's go to the Java folder, or specifically the COM folder in our student files. So we'll head over to our student files. Inside of the student files, under the Java directory, there is this COM folder. Inside of COM, there's MuleSoft, Training, and Flight Java. So this is effectively a package with a Java file inside. We're going to use this Java file a little bit later. For now, let's just take a peek inside to see what it contains. Inside of here, you can see that there's some basic data members of a Java class. There is some constructors and some basic getters and setters throughout. For now, we're not going to make any modifications, but we do want to bring this inside of our Studio application. So to do this, let's drag the COM folder and let's drag it into source main Java on the left side in the Package Explorer. It'll then ask if we want to make a reference or a copy of these files and folders. Let's go ahead and copy them. And if you expand source main Java, you'll now see this package in place, com.mulesoft.training, and inside of that, the flight.java file is placed inside of here as well. Now, let's review the source test folders to get an idea of what's inside. You'll see that there are source test Java, source test MUnit, and source test resources. Source test resources is the only thing that has a file now. In particular, this has a log4j test XML file, specifically logging levels for our test cases. But inside of our browser, in our student files, let's bring in our own set of metadata. So let's head to student files. And in student files, the schemas and examples directory contains some different metadata that we can use throughout this example. So let's expand it. And let's select all of the different flights JSON files. All right. And we'll also go ahead and grab the flights XML and flights JSON inside of here as well. So effectively, let's just grab all the flights and we'll drag these files into source test resources and copy them over. So these are some test files and schemas we'll use in Studio or in test cases, but you'll see in a moment why we specifically want them to live in source test resources rather than in source main resources. All right, so this is a project that we're going to build on throughout class, but for now, let's just see what happens if we were to export this project, pretending we were ready to really deploy it to a Mule runtime. So let's right-click on this project and choose to go to Export. From the export menu, let's expand the Mule option and choose Anypoint Studio Deployable Archive. Inside of the zip file box, we'll go ahead and put it in a directory that we can locate. So it really doesn't matter where, as long as it's somewhere that you can find. All right. And then from our file browser again, let's go to the location that we stored this application package, in my case, apdev flights ws. Let's expand this package out and take a look inside. And what you'll notice in the package itself is that the API contents, such as the RAML, have been brought over. The classes directory has had a bunch of items copied over as well, specifically information like the compiled Java class, the RAML file once again, the properties file and XML files, all inside of this classes directory. You can see outside of the classes, the sources are in here as well, such as global XML, implementation XML, and so on. You'll notice what is absent inside of these main directories is the inclusion of our source test resources. And this is because the source test resources we don't want in our final application package. So it does matter where you put different files. You want to keep your package as light as possible for only the items that it needs to deploy.